I had always been aware of the creepy man who lived in the old, run-down house down the street. His yard was always overgrown and filled with strange objects, like rusty bicycles and broken toys. I had heard rumors that he was a recluse, never leaving his house except to pick up supplies. One day, while walking my dog, I saw the man sitting on his porch. He looked up and gave me a sinister smile that sent chills down my spine. I quickly picked up my pace and tried not to make eye contact with him. But after that encounter, strange things began to happen. I would come home to find my front door open, even though I was sure I had locked it. My dog would bark furiously at the window, but when I looked outside, there was nothing there. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing heavily in my room. My heart racing, I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, but it wouldn't turn on. I fumbled around in the dark, trying to find something to defend myself with, but my hand found nothing. And then I saw him. The creepy man from down the street was standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He was holding something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man just stood there, watching me, until finally he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is my neighborhood." And then he was gone, disappearing into thin air. I was left alone in my dark room, shaking with fear. The next day, I decided to confront the man. I knew it was a risky move, but I couldn't take it anymore. I walked down to his house and knocked on the door. To my surprise, he answered. But as soon as I saw his face, I knew that something was very wrong. His eyes were wild, his skin was pale and clammy, and he was holding a bloody knife. "Come in," he said, beckoning me inside. "Let's have a chat." I knew I should run, but I was frozen with fear. I followed him into the house, and as soon as we were inside, he locked the door behind us. For what seemed like hours, we talked. He told me about his past, about how he had been abandoned by his family and left to fend for himself on the streets. He told me about the things he had seen and the people he had met, and as he spoke, I began to understand why he was the way he was. But then he took out the knife again, and everything changed. He lunged at me, and I barely had time to react. We fought, him trying to overpower me, me trying to defend myself. But in the end, he was too strong. He overpowered me and pinned me to the ground. "I told you not to come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Now you'll never leave." And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a dark, damp room, my hands tied behind my back. I had no idea how long I had been there, but it felt like an eternity. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I lost track of time, my only company the sound of the man's breathing as he watched me from behind the door. In the end, I was rescued by the police, who had been tipped off by a concerned neighbor. But even though I was free, I was never the same. The memory of that night, and the man who had taken me captive, haunted me. I never thought much about the people who lived in the apartment across the hall from me. They seemed like ordinary enough people, going about their business and keeping to themselves. But as time went on, I began to notice strange things happening in their apartment, strange noises, odd smells, and a general feeling of unease that lingered in the air. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a loud banging coming from across the hall. It was so loud that it sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. I was afraid to leave my apartment, but something inside me urged me to go and see what was happening. When I opened the door, I saw my neighbor standing in the hallway. They were covered in blood, their eyes wide and manic. "They're coming for me," they said in a panicked voice. "You have to help me." I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just leave them there. So, I helped them into my apartment and tried to calm them down. As I was tending to their wounds, I couldn't help but notice the strange symbols that were carved into their flesh. They seemed to be some sort of ancient language, and the more I looked at them, the more my neighbor's behavior began to make sense. I asked them what had happened, and they told me a story that sounded like something out of a horror movie. They said that they had been performing some sort of ritual in their apartment, one that had gone horribly wrong. They had summoned something that was not of this world, and it had possessed them, causing them to do unspeakable things. As they spoke, I could feel a presence in my apartment, something dark and malevolent that seemed to be watching us. My neighbor became increasingly agitated, and I knew I had to get them out of there before it was too late. But as I tried to lead them to the door, they suddenly turned on me, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You can't leave," they said, their voice no longer their own. "You're mine now." I tried to fight back, to break free from their grip, but it was no use. I was helpless as they dragged me back into their apartment, the door slamming shut behind us. I don't remember much after that. There was darkness, and pain, and the sound of something laughing in the distance. When I finally came to, I was alone in my apartment, with no memory of how I had gotten there. But I knew one thing for sure, I would never be the same again. The darkness that had taken hold of my neighbor had left its mark on me too, and I would carry that fear with me for the rest of my life.
I had always heard that it's important to get to know your neighbors, but I never imagined that my neighbor would be the stuff of nightmares. From the moment I moved into my new apartment, something about the person living next door seemed off. It started with small things, like the way they would always stare at me whenever I walked by. It was as if they were sizing me up, trying to see if I was worth their time. But then, the odd behavior escalated. I would hear strange noises coming from their apartment at all hours of the night, banging, scraping, and sometimes even what sounded like muffled screams. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Then, one night, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, there was my neighbor, standing on the other side with a wide grin on their face. It was the first time I had seen them up close, and the sight made my skin crawl. Their eyes were a sickly yellow, and their skin looked as if it had been stretched too tightly over their bones. They had an unsettling energy about them, like they were trying to hold back something dark and sinister. "Hello, neighbor," they said in a voice that was too smooth and too pleasant. "I just wanted to introduce myself and invite you over for a little get-together. It'll be fun, I promise." I wanted to say no, to slam the door in their face and never look back. But something about their demeanor was so persuasive that I found myself agreeing to go. When I arrived at their apartment, there were several other people there, all of them just as creepy as my neighbor. They were all dressed in strange clothes and seemed to be part of some sort of cult-like group. They all welcomed me warmly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As the night went on, things got weirder and weirder. They started chanting in a language I didn't understand, and my neighbor kept offering me strange drinks that I was too afraid to accept. But then, the worst part happened. One of the cult members pulled out a knife, and before I knew what was happening, they had plunged it into their own chest. I watched in horror as they fell to the ground, blood pooling around them in a sickening puddle. Everyone else just kept chanting, like nothing had happened. But I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I made my way to the door, but my neighbor was standing in my way. They looked at me with those yellow eyes and smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Leaving so soon?" they asked. "But we haven't even gotten to the best part yet." I pushed past them and ran down the hallway, never looking back. When I got back to my apartment, I barricaded the door and called the police. The cult members were all arrested, but my neighbor was never found. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night, and I'll never forget the terror that came with living next to someone so utterly sinister.
I always knew there was something off about my neighbor, but I could never quite put my finger on it. She lived in the house next door, a small and run-down place that looked like it hadn't been taken care of in years. I rarely saw her outside, and when I did, she would always stare at me with these beady, calculating eyes. But it wasn't until I moved in with my boyfriend, Ryan, that things really started to get weird. It began with small things, like hearing noises coming from her yard in the middle of the night. But then, it started to escalate. One night, Ryan and I were sitting on the couch watching TV when we heard a knock at the door. It was late, and we weren't expecting anyone, so we were hesitant to answer. But the knocking persisted, so we cautiously made our way to the door. When we opened it, there was no one there. We looked around, but the street was deserted. As we turned to go back inside, we heard a low chuckle coming from next door. We both froze, the hairs on the back of our necks standing on end. From that moment on, things only got worse. We would wake up in the middle of the night to find our trash cans knocked over, our plants uprooted, and strange symbols painted on our front porch. But it wasn't until one fateful night that we discovered the true horror of what was happening next door. We were awakened by a blood-curdling scream, coming from our neighbor's house. Ryan and I sprang out of bed and rushed outside, trying to find the source of the sound. As we approached her house, we could see that something was horribly wrong. The windows were shattered, and the door was hanging off its hinges. We cautiously made our way inside, the air thick with a sickly sweet smell that made my stomach churn. What we saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Our neighbor was lying on the floor, covered in blood. Her body had been mutilated, her flesh torn and shredded. But what was most disturbing was the look on her face. It was twisted into a grotesque smile, like she was enjoying every second of her torture. We called the police, but they couldn't find any evidence of who did it. They questioned us for hours, but we couldn't provide any useful information. All we knew was that our neighbor had been leading a double life, one that involved unspeakable horrors. It's been years since that night, but I still have nightmares about what happened. I can't help but wonder if our neighbor was working alone, or if there are others out there like her, lurking in the shadows and waiting to strike. The thought makes my blood run cold, and I know that I'll never truly feel safe in my own home again. It started innocently enough. I moved into a new apartment complex, eager to start fresh after a tough breakup. I was excited to decorate my new space and make it my own, but that excitement quickly faded once I met my neighbor. At first glance, she seemed like any other elderly woman. She smiled sweetly and welcomed me to the building. But as the days went on, I began to notice strange things about her. I would see her lurking in the hallway, always watching me with a strange intensity. Her eyes would follow me as I walked by, and I could feel her gaze on the back of my neck long after I had passed her. One night, I was working late and came home to find a note slipped under my door. It was from my neighbor, and it read, "I heard you come in late last night. Be careful, there are dangerous people out there." I couldn't help but feel uneasy. How did she know when I came home? And what did she mean by dangerous people? I tried to brush it off as concern, but her behavior only grew stranger from there. I would often hear her whispering to herself through the walls, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I would hear her shuffling around her apartment. It sounded like she was moving heavy objects, but I couldn't be sure. One day, I decided to confront her about her behavior. I knocked on her door, and when she answered, her smile quickly faded. Her eyes seemed to bore into mine, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you," I said, trying to sound polite. "But I've noticed you watching me, and I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." She smiled again, but it was a different smile this time. It was cold and calculating, and I knew right then and there that something was seriously wrong. "Don't worry about me, dear," she said. "I'm just looking out for you." I quickly made my escape, but the encounter only left me more terrified than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, even when I was alone in my apartment. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I realized the full extent of her obsession. I came home one day to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, and that's when I saw it. My apartment had been ransacked. Furniture overturned, clothes strewn about, and my valuables missing. It was obvious that someone had broken in, but there was no sign of forced entry. As I stood there, stunned and terrified, I heard a sound behind me. It was my neighbor, standing in my doorway with a satisfied smile on her face. "I told you there were dangerous people out there," she said. "But don't worry, I took care of them for you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Had she orchestrated this break-in to protect me? And what else was she capable of? I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I packed up my belongings and left that same day, but the memory of my creepy neighbor still haunts me to this day. I can't help but wonder what else she's done, and who else she's watching.